All right then. Welcome aboard to the Raiders Rambles for a kind of an impromptu, discussion. And here, I am Jolt, the chief host of the show, and joining us with me are three special guests. Well, not special-ish, but first of all, Filthy Heretic.
Oh, hi.
Kind of give us a kind of a rundown on what brings you here to kind of discuss, what we're here to discuss.
All right, so a few months ago, you were gracious enough to let us on your show to talk about our project, FNet. The basic idea
Yeah.
is to completely decentralize communication and to make it so that everybody is their own uh, communication communication platform. Thus, any censorship by big corporations like Google or through governments like in Article 13 become completely impossible. And well, in the months since we've had that talk, we've had several developments that we're extremely excited to let you guys all know about. I think you're gonna love it.
Absolutely. We'll be talking about more just right after we clear through the introduction space. And next up on the show is Douglas.
Hi, Jolt. It's so nice to be back.
It's been a very long time
I
since we've
haven't been a
had
guest
you.
on your shows in I don't know, what's it been, a year?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's kind of what it is. Though people come in, it's been busy. Yeah. But
Well,
hey,
since then I've become the head of the FNet project, or at least the project manager. I've collected a pretty big team on doing a whole bunch of projects, and we made a lot of progress. And I'd be glad to share anything you have questions about.
no, not a problem. Yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. And our last guest joining us for the show is Esoteric. This is your first time here on the show too, and
Yeah.
please just kind of formally introduce yourself.
Okay. Well, first of all, you said that we're special guests. Well, I don't know if all of us are special. I'm sure one of us is. Doesn't really
Yeah, that's
matter
pretty.
because
You pretty much are, but
psychiatry.
I mean, I'm just doing you guys a special favor.
All right. Well, I was trying to make a joke, but anyway, what I was, I guess, yeah, I was supposed to be here on the last time that you streamed with Filthy Heretic, but there was some miscommunication and I wasn't given a link, or I was out doing some work. It happened a while ago, so I don't remember. Long story short, I wasn't there, but so I'm one of the major figures in the FNet network, along with Filthy Heretic and Doug. My role is I essentially conceptualized FNet and most of the development, not in every point, but in about 90% of what we've done from the ground up. And I was the first one. There's a video on my channel from about Christmas of last year where I basically first announced the project was starting and started looking for people. But to clarify, it's not a sort of hierarchical project. It's a network, so everyone in it essentially is a self-reliant contributor who is organizing with other contributors in order to mitigate individual costs of speculation, and so more information can be communicated more efficiently.
Hmm. I see. I see. But I mean, here we are. Here we all are. So I suppose, without any further ado, I get since the last time, it's been many months since you've gave us an introduction to your project FNet, and now in the months that have followed, you guys have made strides into it. Tell us a bit more about how your current progress, the state of it you're in.
Filthy, would you like to start, and then I could add the details?
Okay, sure. So basically, everything's been crystallized into what could be generously described as a protocol browser. This essentially is something that you can download onto your computer or onto your phone. Everything is based in Lua, so it has enormous amount of compatibility and cross compatibility across operating systems. But what the protocol browser is going to allow you to do is choose which form of communication and how you're data is transferred between user to user, peer to peer. If you want your data to be using some incredibly efficient but fairly low security protocol, that's your prerogative. If you want your data to be transmitted across 5 levels of encryption, it might take a few minutes for your transmission. You might take a few minutes for your data to get to the end point, but you can definitely do this. The point is to create a peer-to-peer network that's kind of I don't want to say layered on top of the internet, but it kind of is. But it also is able to communicate with each other, sort of like a LAN network.
Think of it more of like a side network to how the current internet infrastructure works.
So in essence,
It works in parallel.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Or it could completely replace it in certain areas where it works better.
Right, because you want to. I mean, your goal is pretty much to bypass the ISP as a way of providing internet service to people.
In either case, what it does is it completely undermines the internet as it exists as a sort of proprietary model of communication, and it works to it would make the internet entirely distributed. So.
Okay. As in, you could use some of our test routers to, instead of connect to an ISP, to connect to your neighbor. If your neighbor also had the router or the software that would allow it to connect to our network, you would be able to directly communicate with your neighbor without any intermediate.
Of course, keep in mind how the proprietary network already works. In order to be able to hear my voice, it has to be transmitted to a server somewhere else, which could be thousands of miles away, and then transmitted another thousands of miles to your end. And then finally, this whole conversation is going to have to be transmitted another 1,000 miles back to another server somewhere else, and then finally onto YouTube where people can finally hear us.
This cuts out all of those intermediate steps and makes it so that you could directly do all of the same things that we're doing right now, but with no intermediate points, if it's depending on distance.
And you can imagine that this would be vastly, vastly more efficient. Conversations will be a lot clearer. They'll have less of a problem. Like, I'm assuming you've had conversations on Discord before where people are constantly interrupting each other.
Or constantly roboting. This would make ping, go way down.
So we're talking about a better communication model by default. And because things are able to communicate with each other constantly, this will continue to work even with an internet outage completely. All you need is a source of electricity, and it'll work. Doesn't matter if it's a city power or you just have a farm full of hamsters on wheels. It'll keep working when the internet goes down.
Yep. As long as the two closest endpoints have a power source, internet connection will be possible.
So if somebody gets into a car crash and crashes into some fiber optic cables, well, that's not a problem anymore.
Yeah,
we can just
create a bypass.
A large part of the reason that that there's so little competition in terms of ISPs is because a lot of municipality, a lot of city and county governments restrict who can and cannot lay cable. We're going to be bypassing the problem completely.
And by going wireless.
Everything is going to be completely wireless.
I mean, you could still do a wired network on our system, but it would be more beneficial to do wireless.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's also no central point of distribution as well, so information by default is going to be able to be communicated much more efficiently.
The basic idea, I think I think we told you this before in the last stream, and that is that everybody is going to be able to not only become their own ISP, but through the same software, they're going to become their own
mobile data provider.
Their own mobile data provider, yes.
Consider being able to use a single piece of software installed on two completely different phones. In how the current network works, you have to sign up with a phone provider, get a SIM card installed in your phone, pay for that phone number, and maintain it. With this system, with that system, the one I previously described, you have to pay for the number. You cannot communicate with the device closest to you. Say that before you even shared your phone number with some person who was right next to you also on their phone. You would not be able to communicate with them because they didn't know your phone number either. This would basically allow all of the phones, if they ran our software, to work like Street Pass, if you know what that is.
So it's basically, you know, a constant stream of, you know, and anything you pretty much search for, you can pretty much you know, connect and communicate.
Mm-hmm. As long as you can create a secure connection between two devices, as long as they're actually in, you know, they would actually have to meet first.
Electricity.
Mm-hmm.
And
because
Right.
everything's peer to peer and end to end, what you end up with is going to be you also have complete control over your data. I think I mentioned that starting out.
No data limits anymore.
No data limits, and you can determine how your data is transmitted. Again, you want it to be fast but insecure, or slow as hell, but you'll basically need a qubit infinity quantum computer to be able to crack it.
Because
1 billion
everyone
years
could create
later.
a unique security protocol for their communications.
You could do that too. I mean, our protocol browser is going to be able to upload any protocol you want. So,
You
I
could
mean,
even write your own.
what good is being able? You can't crack a protocol that you don't know exists.
So really, even if you had quantum computing, it really wouldn't do any good.
It would be like trying to decipher an alien language that you don't know what the vowels are.
all right, I mean, it's definitely got some, you know, there's a lot of potential behind it, though. Have you thought about how you know, the scale of which you're going to be able to distribute this, or you be starting small, or just basically, or is it basically something that, you know, that everybody can just go on and become their own? You know?
Everyone could use
It's
it.
open source.
In
Yeah.
terms of in terms of the routers, though, we're going to have to start very small there. But of course, everything's
The
going to be able
software
to be
will
scaled
allow
up.
us to bootstrap that at least.
Yes.
But then as we mentioned, the source code is open. But
It means
I
anyone
mentioned
could then
before-
adapt what we made to their own networks and then connect it back to ours.
Right. Well, then there's also the model which I created of sort of how we could actually distribute these and obtain resources to continue obtaining these routers from us, you know, early on, which would
Sort
It-
of like
it-
a rent to buy idea.
it
If you
would
didn't have enough money to buy a writer right out.
Well, what I was going essentially to this, I wouldn't describe it like that. It's more like us being able to profit while simultaneously giving away these routers for absolutely no cost, because within these routers there's also going our routers, at least the source code won't have this, but anyway, within the routers there will be a small line of code which connects each router that we make to a decentralized cloud mining network. And while each of these routers that we make are online, so essentially when they're connected to a source of electricity, the decentralized network is utilizing a small amount of the router's processing power in order to mine cryptocurrency and then distribute the awarded cryptocurrency from the cache to a few fixed addresses. So basically, the people who created FNet and are creating these routers.
Of course, this is all optional, but it would at least make it so that people could, you know, make profit off of the routers as well.
Yeah, it's
Think
just
of it like
it's-
this, if I may
just
interject.
in the well, I was just going to say it's only in the nodes which we create. Like I mentioned, the source code it's not embedded inherently into FNet.
Yeah.
So if someone were to take the source code we put online and create their own node and connect to FNet on their own, it wouldn't be connected to this network, but the nodes that we give out to people well, because we want as little cost as possible to be associated with it. But we also still need resources to create nodes. We basically killed two birds with one stone. It's free and we profit.
So pretty much, what I'm taking from it is that what I'm going to ask for first and foremost, is there going to when you access the FNet or whatsoever it is, will there be a cryptocurrency miner that will be installed onto your device, or is it just going to be running in the background?
It's an
Just
optional add-on that you could install on your device.
It's going to run in the background, so
In the background.
it will not take up much, if any, noticeable processing power.
Yeah, it's not embedded into FNet at all. So basically, the only way you'd even know that it's in one of the nodes that we're giving out is if you actually looked through the code that was embedded into our routers.
Either that, or we could just say we could have it so that the cryptocurrency option could be installed but uninstallable on the routers that we give out if they buy them from us pre-configured.
Alternatively, you could have people who find the code decide to embed their own crypto address into it, so that the cloud mining is putting into their crypto wallet. That way, they have an incentive to profit off of what we've created, and they're distributing the network for us.
Mm-hmm. Basically, instead of how the current system, when you set up with an ISP, if you don't actually buy a router and then hook it up yourself, the ISP installs their own router, and then on your bill, you rent it from them.
Yeah, I
cable
gotta
box.
be honest. I'm a bit more excited about that, honestly. I mean, FNet's great, but this payment model changes everything in terms of how digital electronics and software is developed.
Instead of you paying to rent the router, you get the router, and then you can pay it off and then make money off of maintaining the network. It literally reverses it.
Yeah, so pretty much if you basically you can pretty much make a living off of hosting your own, network. Pretty much.
You actually could, or you could
Not only that, you could sell off your extra bandwidth to your neighbors.
you actually could do that as well.
Ooh. Seeing a lot of potential in that too.
Yeah, and there's also a great fact in that you don't have to pay Comcast $80 every month. That's
Yeah.
a lot of savings right there. And I can imagine that there's going to be a tremendous number of businesses, small, medium, and large, that would love not having to pay for networking crap like that.
It would actually enable a lot more people to enter the market because the cost of entry is significantly limited, and because of the fact that communication is occurring through distributed means, it makes it basically impossible for these these bits of regulatory capture to be enforced. So basically, copyright trolling, licensing legislative fiat, taxation in general. It's sort of a relic because it's not really possible to be enforced either way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in that sense, though, you'll pretty much strip out all the middlemen and make it so that the only overhead that you need to pay would pretty much be electricity,
Right.
having access to it.
All you
And then we
need
have
is
a whole bunch
electricity.
of methods to solve that so that people could have their own
But
electricity.
that's not related to FNet. I guess
Yeah, that's something else.
that's not to spoil anything, but that's our next project.
Yeah, we got a lot of plans in the works, and of course, one of them is being able to become your own power plant.
Everything a man needs to run his own, run his one-man society.
Well, why
or
not?
at least have a self-sustaining neighborhood so that you don't have to keep paying extreme amounts of money to import food and electricity and internet.
Well, it's actually the other. It's not that you're going to be independent from society, though hypothetically you could. It's that even in aiming to do that, you're structurally incentivized to be productive, and it requires a lot less actual input effort to be productive. And it also undermines all these state established industry cartels and regulatory capture, which makes it more difficult for people to actually make a living for themselves.
In
Everyone,
the end, though, the bottom line is more, more profits, more efficiency, and less
People being able to
repercussions.
live better on
Yeah.
less.
So
Well, less with more,
yeah. So this brings us to pretty much the last. I've got two more questions left. With this FNet thing before we proceed. I mean, I can see that there's a lot of prospect for it though. And aside from ISPs and telecommunications providers, the whole SIM card business, what other industries could you make obsolete? With this new network and communications technology, if a lot of people adopt it.
Well, the two main ones are communications and finance. I sort of went over how that is briefly a moment ago. If you undermine the ability for any sort of centralized arbiter to control how people organize with their finances and to sort of spoof interactions people have, you undermine the state's ability to collect resources for itself. You undermine centralized control over communications necessarily. You allow more people to have more access to more resources, which in turn creates more wealth, and it in turn allows more people to establish more networks around a broader set of marginal preferences that would allow them to essentially do the same thing, but for competing social structures and interests. And most significantly, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but it would it would essentially allow people to completely undermine the state's ability to appropriate resources, and for these sort of market structures created through legislative fiat. And it would also undermine communications as well. And the way it would go about doing that, of course, is the networks by which people communicate through would be entirely distributed. Filthy, you are echoing really bad, and you have been since we started. All right, I now that makes me feel so awkward having to call that. But
Ouch.
yeah. So the other thing that communication, it was distracting me is all. I'm sorry about that, but
No. I mean, I know that feeling too well because I stream and I've had people making background noise, so not a problem.
okay.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
so if you have distributed communication, then you don't have the problems that you have now, where centralized arbiters can manipulate the information which people communicate with one another. And like you don't have the government getting in bed with these ISP companies or starting up these ISP companies as essentially proxies of the intelligence agencies. James Corbett has a pretty good series of videos on that. Not to go too into detail there, but yeah. Long story short, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Google, these companies censoring search results. It's not a product of political bias or market failure. It's a product of politically connected interest groups and these state-sponsored organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations, along with the intelligence agencies directly through programs such as Operation Choke Point or Operation Mockingbird, manipulating financial resources and the internal management of these companies to incentivize them to discriminate politically against certain users. But
that is
Pretty complicated.
It's
But-
it's a long tangent that almost really in three simple words: the government man bad,
Well,
Anyway,
let me try to explain it like this. So you know how in the UK they have hate
MI6
speech
and so
laws.
on, and
If you say the wrong things, your ass is grass.
well, yeah, the
Well,
cops will pretty much knock on your door. I've heard that lots of stories of that. But
it's constant, and it's starting to happen in the U.S. Mostly
Well,
if you criticize police.
yeah,
But
well,
anyways,
it's
how
kind
can the
it
how
kind of
can the
occurs.
excuse me? How can the police arrest you for hate speech if they don't know what you've said? If they can't prove that you said anything?
Well, just what I was going to say though is it kind of is the same in the US. It's just that instead of the government putting out a law which explicitly says the police will arrest you if you do this, in order for the government, the United States government particularly, to maintain its sort of socio-political order, the U.S. government's intelligence agencies like to operate through proxies. And in fact, the term plausible deniability was actually first coined by a CIA director, Alan Dulles, when he was describing exactly that in, I think it was 1971, when he was being asked about the Warren Commission. They
This is
specifically
a little
asked.
too much of a tangent.
Yeah,
You should let me
okay. This
talk.
is it's hard to go into this without going into a lot of the
yeah,
deep
I think this
backstory.
isn't the kind. This is a big. But,
Okay, fine, but
no,
basically, I guess to get back on topic here, so what it does is if you can't is it encrypts sort of all the outlets of communication, and it makes all of the outlets of communication decentralized, and therefore the outlets of communication which exist can only really occur between mutual parties, which means that you don't get a lot of these problems with centralized proprietary outlets through which communication occurs. You don't get a lot of this manipulation. You don't get a lot
A
of
little too
these.
wordy again.
Okay, you don't get a lot of these overarching master narratives being pushed. You don't get algorithmic manipulation. It's just people expressing their own ideas with other people.
right.
Yeah. No man in the middle of communications. If you're talking to someone, it's just you and them.
Yeah, just straight up direct, which is what you wanted to achieve.
What was your next question, Jolt?
All right, the last one is to move on. When do you think we'll be able to take up the testing for FNet? Like when it's going to be rolling out?
Well, we're hoping we'll have first beta testing of the protocol engine by about 2 months to the end of the year.
Yeah, it was actually the end of October, I think we were talking about. We were going to start putting out protocol nodes, or at least that was what we were shooting for.
First thing we're going to try and test is to install the software, well, the test software, on two phones or a computer and a phone, and get them to communicate with each other directly.
That would just be a rough prototype, though, to clarify. It wouldn't have the sort of visual layout which would make it user-friendly. It wouldn't have the...
It's just the back end.
It wouldn't have the decentralized cloud mining network. It would be the
That's just
bare
optional
basic component.
But so
The
basically,
bare basic components.
Yeah, just the bare bones, like the essentials that you need just to be able to communicate directly and connect with the electricity.
But
So
after that's
basic-
done, making the interface should be quite easy.
But basically, what I was going to say about that is we're not putting out too many of those. It's basically just going to be, for that period of time, testing between members of the network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just as long as anybody who subscribes can pretty much, communicate just directly to others, as long as they're, in the network.
Think of it like this. Currently, I don't think I got to finish this idea earlier. Say you have two phones with phone numbers, and then both phones to actually call each other have to know each other's phone numbers and have to have SIM cards and pay for those SIM cards. Using this, you would instead install this copy of our software on both of the phones, and the two phones would then be able to request communications with each other, and then share each other's contacts just by being in proximity to each other. Basically, instead of having to call another phone by first knowing the number, you could have it work like a walkie-talkie, where phones could talk to each other just by being in range. Of course, you would have to first approve the communication.
And yeah, and beyond, right channels, etc.
Yep.
Yeah. But other than that, though, I think that's pretty much. I see what you guys do. What you guys are doing. I think well, all more power to you if you can pull this
Sorry
off.
if we got a little wordy.
No,
That's
I
sort
think
of
it's just, look,
that's on
it's
me.
pretty much the ramblings of a madman who just wanted to say, government went bad, but my group is pretty much, takes the whole, let's not be political activists because that's pretty much what we are. We're right where we want to be, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well, I
it's,
mean,
it's
I think one of the things we
difficult
want
to
to get across is I think one of the things we want to get across is that this is really going to benefit everyone. You don't have to be an ideological libertarian to appreciate the value this can provide. I mean, I think the overwhelming majority of people recognize that the system that Comcast and Verizon have set up is absolutely ridiculous. They're running on ancient technology, and that, well, we can do better.
I mean, take example that in India. In India, they upgraded their phone networks to run on SIP. And so now everyone in India can have a free phone number. And then the internet bills in India, if you were to communicate them back into US dollars, say internet bill would be $1 a month.
Which, by the way, is the reason why a lot of these tech companies around here use India for tech support.
That's the same reason why there's a whole bunch of people
costs.
swarming on Facebook from India too.
Yeah, I get that. We get that a lot, though.
I mean, isn't it sad that India's got better internet infrastructure than us? And they're using the same software that was developed in the year 2000.
And
that's how out of date we are. And that's why we're trying to bring it here.
Can provide it on a bigger scale because of their high population numbers. But then again, you got to remember how much of India still doesn't have internet access.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, definitely something to consider when you're when you're rolling out and distributing,
Mm-hmm.
so on. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's pretty much with your vision, like as long as have access to electricity, then yeah.
I can give you an example of how some of this same software that we're developing has already started to spring up on, the American coasts. For example, over in New York, there's a project called NYC Mesh. They're doing almost the same thing that we're doing, except that I don't believe that they have open source router firmware for their system. It's more like they're connecting directly to the internet backbone and then providing a Wi-Fi internet service provider to give everyone cheap internet. We're taking what they did and taking it 10 steps further.
All right, yeah, it's for a big, kind of like for larger scale and for benefits.
And what I was gonna say that I wasn't allowed to finish is that the getting wordy, that was more on my part, and that's just because it's difficult to explain, the full extent to how communication through the media is manipulated and why it's important to understand it. I mean, I suppose it would probably take an entire stream just to fully get into the totality of all of it.
And you've already done videos on it, so you could just recommend those videos.
I've done like 5 videos on it.
But I think the thing is that you just have to explain it in such a way that people can can pick it up, it clicks, and without getting too much into the nuts and bolts of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I think that's pretty much what I kind of wanted to hear, though. So I suppose all the best for you guys, and when you have something big for us, keep me in the loop. So
all right,
in that sense, though, what would be the next item that you'd kind of want?
Well, Filthy, Esso, would you be willing to start taking up describing what agorism and voluntarism is?
All right. So, voluntarism in one sentence is everybody should associate voluntarily. The basic idea is that all social relationships, or people are going to need social relationships. Like this is something I think we all agree with. We're not
Mhm.
animists, obviously, but the question is like, based on what basis are these associations going to be made? Now, you would think that it would be common sense that people should associate with someone else because they want to. It might be a business relationship in which they get something out of it. They and the other person gets something as well. Sort of like an employer-employee relationship. The employee looks at that and thinks, "Oh my God, I cannot believe this guy is willing to give me so much money for so little work." The employer thinks, "Oh my God, I cannot believe this guy is willing to do this for this little amount of money." Both parties benefit. Of course, it's basically just benefit of exchange. You can have like romantic relationships. You can have uh, friendships. All of these relationships are because people perceive a benefit. They have some way that they. I'm getting a little wordy here. Basically, people should work with each other and associate because they want to. But the problem that we have with the government is that you are forced to associate with it. You cannot opt out of doing things like complying with their imperial decrees. You can't choose not to pay taxes. Well, I mean, you could, but it's like a Hobson's choice, where it's like you could choose to shoot yourself in the foot. It's not really much of a choice, is it? The point is that we are coerced into associating with an organization that functions identically to a criminal organization. It takes our money, it restricts our ability to associate with others and to use our resources. And ultimately, like, I just don't see a reason why you can justly argue for the existence of the state.
If I
I
may
am glad.
interject,
I'm glad that I was just going to add on by explaining Gorism, and I am
okay.
so glad Filthy was the one who explained anarchism because I definitely would have been a bit more wordy there. But so from this, one of the main criticisms you hear a lot for libertarianism and voluntarism or anarchism or whatever you want to call it is that it's it's always moral or ethical arguments, and as valid as they may be, there's no means of actually having this realized in society. Now, of course, there are various counters to that. There are a lot of realistic means by which libertarians have conceptualized for how to achieve this, but the one that carries the most explanatory power and the one which both Filthy Heretic and I have adopted and explain regularly on our channel is a method known as agorism. And simply what agorism is the use of creating some is organizing in self-sufficient subversive networks. So you get individual people who organize in this more efficient model where each individual in a network instead of organizing within sort of hierarchical model. They organize in networks in order to mitigate individual costs of speculation and for information to be communicated more efficiently. And they do this in order to reduce the costs of trading and the specific benefits associated in organizing in means which undermine the state's interests and the interests of these structures created to benefit the state. So, by creating innovations which, say, undermine the ISP government partnership, like we've done with FNet, that would be a great example of an agorist association, and the end goal being to incentivize people to trade in ways simply out of in pursuit of their own material benefit in a way which makes it impossible for the government to continue collecting resources for itself, and which creates more wealth and productivity within gray and black markets, which, according to the five definitions of markets in the sort of in
Keep this a little bit simple, please.
okay.
Like in that sense, though, you basically just want more. I guess you just the end goal is to pretty much to kind of create a system where people are more accessible to things like resources and services without
Hmm.
and while pretty
Provide
much
all the
taking it
same
out of
services that the government provides without you having to be stolen from to provide those services.
Basically, using gray and black markets to avoid paying taxes and avoiding funding the state and then starving the state of resources.
And
Hmm.
yes, and creating networks and innovations which specifically seek to undermine the way in which the state bolsters its own interests.
And then
So
also allow for the people who partake in these networks to supply their own resources for themselves and become self sufficient so that they can take care of themselves better and those they care about.
Mm, I see. And I suppose to move on to kind of to go on a little bit of a side thing. I mean you two recently took to the streets to kind of to get people more and more to see the whole deal of agorism, right?
right.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the climate march, right?
Right, yeah. Because
I
that
mean,
was I had a look at it, and then I saw you were pretty much talking to a couple of these demonstrators to kind of to see that, and maybe to kind of find an alternative to to solving the climate problem rather than just just railing against the government.
hmm and unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of the conversations that I had on my phone because I was recording on my phone and I had memory space issues.
And as you
So
saw, there was absolutely nobody there at my at the climate strike that I went to.
I'm. It still kind of blows my mind that I know it's San Antonio, which is a fairly conservative city. I'm still surprised that in a major metropolitan area that the eco-fascists still can't get more than 80 people to show up. That's pretty embarrassing in my opinion.
And I live in Washington State, so it's not a necessarily conservative area, and
God, like
that was the turnout there. So
like
Yeah.
my dudes, like when I think eco-fascist, I think literally nothing but right-wing paganistic lovers who worship Mother Nature, rather than what passes for traditional climate change protesters.
hmm But what's funny is that like I was listening to some of the speeches that the organizers insisted on doing every 10 minutes. It was hard to have conversations with people because I was constantly being interrupted by them. I don't know, they
Yeah,
just like hearing the sound of their own voice.
probably
But when I
probably
was
better.
able to have
If you, probably might be better if you were listed in as a guest speaker, so that way might be probably one
well,
avenue of
probably,
I
I mean, I
suppose.
probably should have just gone on and just like they like the organizer invited people to like talk about what their conversations were like with other people, and I probably could have used it as a platform. Only problem is that I'm shy. But one thing I did find, I didn't realize this at first, but I'm kind of getting into it as the thing was wrapping up. An hour and a half early before it was scheduled to wrap up, I might add, that you can actually reach these people very easily by framing agorism as a method for combating pollution. You see, the what is it called? The U.S. military is the largest polluter in the world by a very significant margin. And so, if you frame agorism as a method of not only attaining peer-to-peer networks and helping support each other and achieving all these vague goals and platitudes that they like to throw around, but you can also frame it just sort of like, look, you can starve the state of resources, you can starve this massively polluting military of resources, then a lot of them are going to be very receptive to that. They
Right.
very much like thought like, yeah, this is I'm on board with this. I don't know how many of
Yeah.
them pursued what I talked about beyond that one conversation, but it does show that yeah, we can reach these people.
and
Like yeah.
that's exactly what my sort of mentality going into it was, is that and this is sort of you're echoing again, Filthy.
One moment.
But yeah, just what I was going to say is that there seems to be this sort of almost knee-jerk rejection to the climate debate as it is colloquially framed in mainstream politics. But as I sort of went on to argue in my video, I think that libertarians and anarchists particularly have a very strong interest in whether or not, regardless of their perspective on the issue of
Climate change.
anthropogenic climate change, they would have an interest in working with a lot of these climate activists to create these counter economic networks, because what undermining these fuel cartels on an international scale and undermining a lot of these governmental bodies' ability to continue functioning, what that would do is it would, of course, it would deprive the state the ability to collect resources, but more specifically, what it would do is it would undermine petrodollar recycling, which is how central banks currently are able to continue functioning despite, just printing money.
Infinite
And
debt.
yeah, so if they were able to do that, then we would either have to go back to we would have to go back to a system essentially as it is right now. What a world without central banks would look like would basically be a mix, in my opinion, between free banking, like what existed in Scotland during the early 17th century, where you had essentially a series of reserve banks competing with one another over their currencies.
We're getting a little off topic here.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. Basically, anybody who's against the Fed should be inserting themselves into the climate debate as counter economists.
How about I put this more simply as you can achieve all of the anti-pollution methods that you want by just going with self-sufficiency and more efficient resources than fossil fuels by finding alternatives and then spreading them. They would achieve all their goals without having to appeal to the government.
Well, you'd be able to simultaneously appeal to these end the Fed types, of which, may I add, of course, we're among them. You would also simultaneously appeal to a lot of these eco-socialist Green New Deal types as well, because
sorry to interrupt, but I see this whole climate change things way different lenses than you, and to be honest,
would you like to interject?
The thing is just I just don't. I can see what you're trying to do, like maybe to see if you can hope with optimistically get the cooperation of these guys to kind of achieve your end goal as well. But I suppose ultimately, what you kind of want with the whole agoristic thing is just to kind of better how people live their lives in that sense, just without the influence of things like governments and so on. Is that kind of what it is?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What were you going to interject about in terms of climate change?
I suppose my whole perceptive of my whole perception on this is more like to do with what most big news pushers of climate change really
they're really pushing for regulatory capture and more government. That's all they want to do with climate change.
But rather like society, more like social issues kind of front is like you see them all like pushing let's all eat meat, let's all eat bugs instead of meat, let's get rid of cows, let's stop having children because my environment.
Yeah, you would be able
fix it. If you want to solve factory farming, start making bioprinters so you can print bacon.
Exactly. You could literally subvert those narratives, and that's another important aspect of why I think libertarians should be inserting themselves more into the climate debate through this approach, because essentially how the climate debate has been framed is within a false dichotomy where it's either you need one world government Islamic communism or the world is going to burn, and that's not really
There's more
true.
than black and white solutions to this.
Right, but ultimately they just present it as a way of, getting more and more control while depriving people of, quality
Well,
life.
it's
Well,
it's
who
a
do you
way
think
of,
benefits
it's a
from
way
that?
of it's a way
Right.
of normalizing the government expanding itself over society. In reality, what they want is essentially a carbon rationing scheme, because that would be essentially their way, the government's way of going forward in relation to recent developments on the energy front.
Mhm.
But yeah,
And all that a carbon
a
rationing scheme
very
would do, in quotations, carbon rationing scheme, would be monopolization of fuel so that the government gets the big cut.
but what I was going to say though is a very important thing that a lot of people could be pointing out, as Filthy Heretic touched upon earlier, is that historically the biggest polluters in history and the worst ecological disasters have come as a result of government agencies. I mean, most of them within the 20th century. If you go, the Black Lake incident in the Soviet Union, Chernobyl, if a lot of those, came out of nationalized services.
Right.
But then, even if you look at a lot of the ones that happened in the United States, such as the Love Creek incident, that's painted as a product of market greed. But I mean, in reality, the company which owned that tire plant, which was turned into a school, they essentially were trying as hard as they could to get the government not to take that property, and the government tried to sue them because despite the company there warning them, you cannot build a school here because there's a bunch of toxic waste here. The government, for whatever reason or another, they wanted a school there, and they could not be deterred. So, and then there's the Colorado River incident. There's really
Animus River.
Okay.
there's
Right.
no end to the amount of ecological disasters which were either caused by the tragedy of the commons or by nationalization. So that's a more important thing to point out, that if people actually had their assets tied directly to their own material resources, and you didn't have all these
Middlemen, pretty much, to kind of hold you back, then in any case,
and ways to mitigate the costs of pollution created by the government or associated with the government, you really wouldn't have a lot of pollution. You'd have a lot cleaner of a world.
right. But essentially, though, ultimately, I guess I've been just looking at all these, cases of mishandling, cover-ups, etc., especially things, and well, yeah.
Would you like to hear the story of the Chicago stockyard?
Oh yeah, that's
Sure.
that's a, that's a,
Yeah, let's keep it a little bit kind of short and simple, but we've
Okay,
got a couple more minutes, but yeah.
sure. I think it was like in the 1890s, the Chicago stockyard opened, which was basically a industrial slaughterhouse. They produced all of their waste, or they produced a lot of waste products from slaughtered animals and dumped it into the river. Suffice to say, the river was ruined. But what ended up happening is that the government tried to step in. It even tried to divert the river in order to clean it up. Didn't work. What did end up cleaning the river, however, was the Chicago stockyards, creating new innovations in what can be used by the pigs and the animals that they slaughtered in terms of useful products. What ended up happening is that the Chicago stockyard no longer needed to dump the bodies because they were using the entire pig. There was a saying at the time that the Chicago stockyard used everything from the pig except the oink. So what ends up happening is that pollution is just another product that has yet to be commercialized.
Could, or is somebody
Think of it
somebody's
like
sure
this:
gonna
all of our polluted materials can be recycled into something that could be used into some, profitable.
yeah, something like waste not whatnot, like
Yeah.
and
Think of that big garbage island out in what, the Atlantic or the Pacific. Think if you melted that down and created a big floating island, sort of seaport thing out at sea for fishing and ocean farming, or maybe used it
Well,
to help make coral reefs or something.
not even, you don't even need to, turn it into an artificial island. I mean, there are already a lot more uses for plastic right now that are having a hard time being commercialized because of patent agencies. I don't know
Right.
if you heard. I don't know if you heard of this, but there's a machine that came out in 2017, I think it was, called the Philobot, which essentially it turns any plastic that you put into it into 3D printer filament, and which can then be 3D printed, obviously, into
Anything you want.
whatever you want it to be.
No more waste plastic if you can just turn it back into useful things when you're done with it.
yeah, but that's pretty much the bottom line of it is though just to make use of all of the waste that you've got, and somebody
Hmm.
would pretty much better
Well,
better life and
I
make
mean,
things a bit
then
more.
there's also externalized costs, which would be cleared up entirely if there wasn't regulatory capture, and these companies actually had an incentive to maintain their property, which only really exists if they actually own the resources which they're using. I mean, if you take the logging industry, for example, most of this deforestation happens in national forest areas where governments basically give monopoly privileges to certain companies over others. But if you look at the logging that occurs on private lands, well, what happens is these logging companies will actually take into their budget the cost of planting new trees, and the incentive there for why they would do that on their land is obvious. Well, if they run out of trees, then they can't continue, profiting off of lumber. So if they didn't, they would go out of business.
Hmm.
How about we
Okay,
let Joel ask another question? I feel like
I
we're
think
giving a
I
little too
think
much.
I think you at this point, yeah, we're pretty much cutting it a little close there. So maybe I suppose I could pretty much flip the tables around and like see if you can ask me whatever anything you kind of like in terms of what we're talking about today, or anything you'd like to know about my group, etc. Furry Raiders.
Yes. Yeah, we should probably. You guys ask him a whole bunch about that. Yeah.
We went too far into political issues and not
Yeah,
enough about ourselves. But then again, there's not really that much for us to talk about.
I mean, to be fair, I'm not really that interested in talking about myself at least. I'm not important. What I what I want to say and what I want to do, that's important.
I feel the same way, but it's not that I don't have a lot of things to talk about. It's that most of what I have to talk about is not really pertaining to myself individually. But okay, sure. Let's ask Jolt some questions.
go right ahead. Anything you guys can't come up with?
I
Well,
figured.
why don't you give a rundown of what the furry raiders are?
Well, essentially, we are basically a furry group with which puts a premium on freedom of speech and expression in a kind of a community that's basically become a bit more more increasingly politicized and so on, like other communities, especially when you look at because not even gaming and comic books are immune to this too, and we've kind of gotten our own version of that in a sense. But ultimately, our group is strict, is more or less non-political in the sense that we're not activists, and all political affiliations are welcome, etc. And yes, we tend to have a lot of more of a presence, in out in the real world. We want people ideally to be, more free to speak, more free to be expressive and adventurous. And
Yeah, but
I'd say we're about the same thing. We're anti-political.
I've been lurking in the Furry Raiders Telegram group for a bit, and I have seen a couple people who are self-proclaimed socialists jumping around. Obviously, it's perfect. Nothing wrong with them being there. I'm just pointing it out.
no, right.
We have a couple, and yeah, within the FNet network, there are a couple of people I believe who are of a similar political persuasion who are contributing to the network. So it truly is apolitical and merely based around material interests.
Hmm.
But rather, you have basically, taking the government thing is pretty much a tangential objective, though. Whereas our stuff is just really does not involve any kind of
Yeah.
politics at all.
I mean, you guys just want to talk about furry stuff and do furry things.
More or
There's-
less, yes. I mean, at the same token, the political discussions are not banned, etc.
Of course, and people.
But
I, I would see why a community where free political discussion can happen within the furry community, where that becomes controversial, even though it really shouldn't be. Because I've seen some of the stuff on like Twitter from a lot of these
yeah,
self-proclaimed furries, and holy, I've thought about like making videos about what some of the hot takes from these people, because I'm convinced at least a good half of them, a lot of these political furries, like I've seen some stuff that's so stupid. I actually I'm questioning whether or not these people are like legitimately retarded or not.
right. I mean, believe me, I've seen my fair share. I've been buddied. That's a story for another time. Buddy with a group that's been consumed by politics, even though they're pretty much, even though
You
now
talking about Xanadu?
oh god, yeah, they're pretty much evidence that the horseshoe theory exists. But anyway, in that sense, though, ultimately, we just want the fandom to pretty much, return to its heart, the soul, and the spirit of it, and get the politics out of it. Like, leave that all behind the door, and
And you're
I
doing
mean,
this
we
through
totally agree
example.
with that.
Well, to clarify, there's a difference between something which is apolitical and something which is anti-political.
But yeah, we
Uh,
don't take the whole anti-political thing.
Yeah,
So,
anti-politics is the means by which you
yeah,
promote views which aim to dismantle the political system as it's created by the state.
yeah,
So,
but that's pretty much that's pretty much not the kind of angle we're going for.
and FNet is anti-political, just to
Right.
clarify. So it'd be fair to
But it
characterize the furry
would be
race.
perfectly supportive to your group, though.
Of course.
I mean,
And-
You would
it's-
be able
it's,
to run everything that you currently run on it without
a
having to
general
worry about Telegram or Discord or any of the other platforms that you run on censoring you anymore. Think of like how Gab is an alternative to Twitter, and they used ActivityPub from Mastodon to make it so that they couldn't be taken down anymore. Our network
it is,
is
yeah.
basically doing the same thing, but you can run any protocol on it.
Right. But yeah, so that I suppose hopefully that pretty much gives you kind of a good rough idea of what my group is about. I've got time for like one or two questions you can answer me.
Yeah, sure.
If
You
can come up
guys
with any.
got any other questions for Jolt?
Let's see here. How often are you on Twitter? I mean,
No,
it's a random question, I know, but
it's very intermittent though. I mean, these days because I personally have to drive to work, etc., a lot less. So that means I literally can. If I know life, I could pretty much be on Twitter. Like, I can only spend like a couple minutes a day, so not very often.
If I were you, I would just leave the platform. I mean, I'm kind of surprised you're not banned yet.
No,
But
it's not
yeah.
because it's. I mean, sure, it's. I mean, I'm not too big on the political scene. I really mellowed out, etc., etc.
Well,
But
the problem with Twitter is that you basically have to be political in order to use the platform, and basically, if you're not a Marxist, you'll be banned.
That's pretty much, because of Twitter's special, agenda, special interest, and their ultimate goal, unfortunately. Till 2020, etc. But again, story for another time.
I'm sorry,
That's
what was that you said?
ultimately that whole Twitter thing, like what Esoteric was saying was pretty much a story for because I think it's just going to culminate in the whole 2020 election. But yeah, but I don't go. But me personally, I'm not super duper active on Twitter, and I pretty much will pop in, here and there to make tweets and so on.
Yeah,
Although I
just
don't really have an awful lot to tweet about.
yeah. I mean, I don't know what it is. I kind of just got bored of the platform. I knew for a fact that Twitter was manipulating my timeline,
Yeah,
and at that point, I was just like,
yeah,
yeah,
no
why
problem.
why am I?
Yeah,
Nope.
why are you here? Exactly.
Why-
All right.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I
Uh,
haven't touched it in months. I know I'm not banned for some reason, probably because I'm not as combative as others, but
Yeah, they ban you for the silliest of reasons too, so
I,
that
I
doesn't
got
really do any favors.
Yeah, I got banned back in February of 2018 because I made fun of and I pointed out a bunch of the weird inconsistencies about David Hogg.
Yeah, that's blah. That David Hogg guy. But
he's
yeah,
he's going to be the he's one of the examples of one of the quote unquote kids that
yeah,
progressives like to trot out to. And you can see why they do this, and I'll probably just mention this real quick, simply for our audience's sake, because once you know the trick, it's you're not going to fall for it. But basically, they want to create a character for which you can empathize with, that you can
yeah.
empathize with,
It's
attach
pretty
your
much
emotions to.
yeah.
Yeah,
That's pretty much what it is.
whenever people start becoming too skeptical, even in the mainstream circles of a narrative which the state is trying to push really hard, what they'll do is they'll get some like child actor figure, they'll roll them out, and then they'll get them to start spewing the same rhetoric. And then treating anyone who disagrees with it as if they're some horrible people because they're attacking a child just because they happen to oppose that political view.
Yeah,
Uh,
you've pretty much seen it as well with the whole Greta Thunberg
yeah,
episode as well,
Here's
which
a
is
that's a more recent example, and yeah, I'm kind of. I want to make a video about it on YouTube, but given that YouTube recently has been starting to behave a lot like Twitter in the months before I got banned from Twitter, I'm pretty sure if I made a video on Greta Thunberg, it would probably get stricken down. But yeah, there are some like open connections between Greta Thunberg and these and political organizations connected to Al Gore, and a lot of these organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations, which are sponsored by these multinational governments.
yeah. I mean I know they're pretty much basically just prop them up, let them loose, and don't even call them like crisis actors. Oh no, you can't have that. But yeah,
have you
that
heard
pretty
the
much.
Does the name Severn Cullis Suzuki sound familiar to anyone?
Nope. Sorry.
Didn't think so. She was basically Greta in 1992, basically
But
propped
yeah,
up in front of the UN to do literally the exact same thing. Although I did listen to her speech from 1992, and it is interesting in the nostalgic sense, simply because of all of the ecological buzzwords that have changed over the last 20,
decade or
30
two.
years.
Yeah, they changed a few of the buzzwords from
Post
Suzuki's speech, but yeah, it's like almost word for word the exact same speech, but given in 1992.
It's like anyone remember when the holes in the ozone layer were a huge crisis?
And
Oh,
then that
that
just went
yeah,
away.
And then the holes in the ozone layer just miraculously repaired themselves because the Earth does that.
yeah. I had a study like
I mean,
when I
lightning strikes produce ozone. That alone fixes the problem.
for crying out loud, we had to learn about chlorofluorocarbons back towards the end of primary school. But then again, that pretty much. boop, never heard anything about climate change until freaking now.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah,
remember.
sure, it's
Yeah,
good
so-
to get rid of those harmful chemicals, but at the same time, they over-exaggerated the damage to such an extent that it made everyone
That's-
freak out so that they could
that's-
politically manipulate people.
So that's pretty much them. They've now become a freaking, doomsday cult and a religion because have you freaking heard, like, to touch on one last point, that how they want people to confess their climate sins to plants.
I
In
have
front-
seen that, yes,
I'm sorry, what the fuck?
and in
I have
Switzerland,
not seen this.
and in Switzerland, there was a funeral held for an iceberg that melted.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, have you seen that?
No, but all I've seen is like people were confessing to plants their sins of their climate sins.
This
I
is
have-
literally becoming a religion.
Yeah,
I-
that's pretty
even
much
more. Well,
what the
it's it's already a heavily presuppositional argument. The position of anthropogenic climate change. The problem with it is that it's been modified and the goalposts have been shifted so many times that there really isn't even a coherent truth claim
No.
anymore. And this is made evident when you actually look at the claims which these pseudoscientists use to support the position that there is anthropogenic climate change happening. That they use things such as there being more mist, but also less mist in the San
Right.
Francisco Bay Area.
It-
Leaves which are changing color more radically during the fall, but also changing color less. Both are used as examples of climate change. So that it's not a falsifiable argument anymore. It's
Right.
basically just it doesn't carry any explanatory power.
a lot of this stuff just boggles, and yet they have to keep pushing it just for whatever stupid kind of agenda though. But eventually, though, people will just kind of eventually tune out and get enough of it. But I digress though. But in all that sense of it though, I think it's high time we kind of wrap this up though.
Yeah, we've been going on for about an hour.
Yeah,
Hour and
that's-
15 minutes, actually.
But
I guess
that's-
final statements then?
Yeah, well, I've been told by Filthy and Jolt now I was being wordy, and I apologize for that. Perhaps we should do another stream sometime, going into greater detail about some of these concepts. But
I mean,
If we'd
it's
be
just
welcome
something
back on a stream with you sometime in the future soon.
I mean, it's just something you got to work on, just pretty much learn how to be able to concisely present your points, etc., without, running off on these tangents. But other than that, though, no, what you said was quite a lot, there's definitely a lot that you can learn about with what you guys have been saying. And there's definitely, something that you guys can look forward to. So,
we go into greater detail about all the concepts which were brought up here on our channel, Back Alley Philosophy. So if anyone who's watching is interested and wants to see that, well, they could go ahead and find our channel. Don't know if it'll be linked, but
And if anyone wants any further information on FNet, please DM me on Telegram or finding on other platforms, and I should be able to talk to you or even help you get started on helping the project if you want.
oh yeah, we're getting pretty late in development here, so there's gonna within the next month, there's going to be a lot more announcements coming out of that. So if you're just learning about FNet now, I mean, this is a good time to learn about it because this is probably the most exciting time for the whole project.
I mean, yeah, I suppose the best way is pretty much a link and some forth that will, kind of give you the goals, the kind of the basic structure and so forth. So, but other than that, though, I guess.
Filthy, do you have any closing statements to give, Joel?
The only real closing statement I have is just to remind the audience that the FNet project, although it is a fundamentally anti-political project, it's not really, it's something that everyone can get behind. It appeals to everyone's interest, and it doesn't matter what your political persuasion is. We're willing to welcome all the help we can get. Doesn't matter if you call yourself a capitalist, a socialist, a communist, or even a fascist. Everyone is going to be able to benefit from what we're working on. And I do want to say thank you again, Jolt, for letting us on to your stream to talk about this stuff.
No, not a problem. So, in that sense, though, just as a kind of personal last kind of brief down. What do you think about me? Me and the boys basically getting Milo into the group.
It'd be awesome if we could meet him somehow.
It's glorious.
Fly to Chicago in December. We might just be able to see the guy.
Ooh,
That's an option.
it is.
Chicago in December. Okay.
Yeah,
I've-
plan to
it's-
hit up
I've-
Midwest Fur Fest. So
I mean, I went to college in Chicago, and I know what Chicago winters are like. It's actually not that bad.
dude, I've done Midwest Fur Fest 2015, Chicago in the winter. I know how you feel about that. But yeah, that's pretty much how if you want to see Milo, try and get to Chicago. And we'll keep you updated, if Milo just has whatsoever plans. But yeah, you don't see, this isn't something you see every day, huh?
It's really not.
No. But in that sense, though, you guys will basically be getting a copy of the stream, and we'll be keeping it up on our own archive too. We'll be getting an audio version up on our own audio distributors, and this will be signing out. Farewell, and until next time.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.